Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey back in time. Not to mighty battles or grand castles, but right into the very kitchens and dining halls of the Middle Ages. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. You're walking through a smoky, bustling medieval town. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something that smells vaguely of stale cabbage and unidentifiable meat. You pass by a grimy store where a vendor is hawking what looks suspiciously like a blackened, lumpy sausage. You feel a sudden pang of hunger and then a wave of nausea because you quickly realize that your modern, discerning palate and likely your stomach probably won't survive this trip. Seriously, what these folks considered a good meal might make your digestive system stage a full-scale revolt. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always wild to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in a rather cramped, dark dwelling, typical of a medieval peasant's home. The air is damp, and the only light comes from a small, sputtering fire in the hearth. The smell, you've quickly learned, is a constant companion. What immediately strikes you, if you were to peer into the humble larder, is the sheer, overwhelming presence of grain. It's everywhere. Sacks of it, sheaves of it, and the ever-present, sometimes slightly mouldy, loaves of bread. You see, for the vast majority of medieval society, especially the serfs and common folk, bread wasn't just part of the meal. It was the meal. It was the backbone, the filler, the utensil, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and gnawing hunger. Imagine your daily life revolving around the harvest. From dawn till dusk, you're toiling in the fields, your hands calloused, your back aching. And what fuels this relentless labor? Most likely, it's a coarse, dark loaf of bread, probably made from rye or barley, perhaps mixed with a bit of oats. This isn't your artisanal sourdough or fluffy white sliced bread. Oh no, this is heavy, dense, and often quite tough. It's designed to fill you up and stay with you, providing the slow release energy needed for a day of backbreaking work. It's often baked in communal ovens, a social ritual in itself where everyone brings their dough and waits for their turn. This shared baking process was a huge part of community life, a place where gossip was exchanged and friendships forged, all centered around the creation of this vital foodstuff. One of the more fascinating, and frankly, a bit disturbing, quirks of medieval bread was its occasional role beyond mere sustenance. You might find yourself eating a trench of bread. No, not a trench of bread, but a trencher, which was literally a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate. You'd pile your meager stew or vegetables onto it, letting the bread soak up the juices, and then, when you were done, you'd either eat the soggy trencher or, more often, give it to your dog or the poor. Talk about zero waste. It's an ingenious, if not entirely appetizing, solution to the lack of proper dinnerware, and historians still argue whether the primary reason for trenchers was truly econom saving on potteria, if it was a deliberate culinary choice to enhance the meal's flavors. The sheer volume of grain consumed was staggering. An average medieval person might consume several pounds of bread a day. Think about that for a second. That's a lot of carbs, even for someone doing intense manual labor. And while wheat was preferred, especially for the more affluent, it was often too expensive for the common person. So rye, barley, and oats became the staples, sometimes mixed with legumes like peas or beans to stretch the flour further. The quality of your bread was often a direct indicator of your social standing. The finer, whiter bread made from sifted wheat flour was reserved for the nobility and the clergy, a symbol of their elevated status. Your bread, my friend, is probably a dark, hearty, and somewhat gritty affair, full of bran and whatever other bits snuck in during the milling process. You might even find the occasional pebble or insect, adding an unexpected crunch. Just a little extra protein, right? This focus on grain meant that agricultural failures, like a bad harvest, were utterly catastrophic. Without the grain, there was no bread, and without bread, there was widespread famine. You can imagine the constant anxiety that must have permeated medieval life, knowing that your very survival hinged on the whims of the weather and the fertility of the land. It made every harvest a moment of profound relief, a temporary reprieve from the ever-present threat of starvation. And yet, despite the simplicity, this reliance on bread fostered a deep connection to the land and the cycles of nature, a connection we've largely lost in our modern world of endless supermarket aisles. As your journey through the medieval kitchen continues, stepping out of the shadows of the grain silo, you soon realize that while bread was king, it wasn't the only thing on the menu for the common folk. For the vast majority of medieval Europeans, life was a relentless cycle of toil, and their meals reflected this reality. Simple, nourishing, and often, well, a bit monotonous. Your next encounter is likely with the ubiquitous gruel or pottage. Imagine a thick porridge-like concoction simmering constantly over an open fire, acting as a perpetual lukewarm comfort in a cold, hard world. This wasn't some delicate Instagram-ready breakfast bowl. It was the ultimate culinary shapeshifter, adapting to whatever meager ingredients were at hand. This pottage would be made from whatever grains were available: oats, barley, peas, or beans, boiled down with water or perhaps a thin stock. To this you'd add whatever vegetables you could cultivate in your small garden plot or forage from the surrounding woods. Think cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips, and maybe some wild garlic or nettles. These greens were vital, providing much needed vitamins and minerals that the bread alone couldn't offer. You might even find yourself adding a few herbs for flavor if you were lucky enough to have them growing nearby: parsley, sage, thyme, or maybe some marjoram. The beauty, or perhaps the curse, of pottage was its flexibility. It was a dish that could be stretched to feed many, and its ingredients could vary wildly depending on the season and the family's fortunes. The taste, you ask? Probably earthy, bland, and somewhat watery, though occasionally elevated by the smokiness of the open fire. There was little in the way of strong seasoning. Salt was valuable and often taxed, and pepper was an exotic luxury. So you'd learn to appreciate the subtle flavors of boiled roots and greens, perhaps with a hint of bitterness from wild plants. And the texture varies from thin and soupy to a thick, almost solid mass you could cut with a knife. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants genuinely enjoyed their simple fare or merely endured it as a means of survival. Given the lack of alternatives, perhaps endured is closer to the mark. A rather quirky tidbit about these humble greens is their incredible versatility. Beyond just being boiled into pottage, some plants, like nettles, were surprisingly common. You might think of nettles as merely an annoying weed that stings, but in medieval times, they were a valuable source of food. Young nettle leaves, when blanched, lose their sting and can be used like spinach, rich in iron and vitamins. Imagine trying to explain that to your local supermarket cashier. Yes, I'd like 2 pounds of stinging nettles, please. It highlights a pragmatic approach to foraging, where every edible plant was known and utilized. Meat, for the peasant, was a rare luxury. Forget your weekly Sunday roast. If you were lucky, you might have a few chickens or perhaps a pig that would be slaughtered once a year, providing a precious source of protein. More often, any meat would come from wild game that could be snared or caught, or perhaps a share of a communal hunt, though hunting rights were often strictly controlled by the lord of the manor. Fish, especially freshwater fish from rivers and ponds, might supplement the diet, particularly on fast days when meat was forbidden by the church. These fast days, which we'll delve into more later, played a significant role in shaping the medieval diet, forcing people to rely even more heavily on plant-based foods. The daily routine was simple: wake with the sun, eat a meager breakfast of stale bread and perhaps some leftover pottage from the night before. Then off to the fields for hours of relentless labor. Midday, a light meal again, probably bread and some pottage. The main meal of the day would come in the evening after the work was done, allowing a bit more time for preparation and consumption. It was a utilitarian approach to eating, designed to provide the necessary calories for survival, not for pleasure or gourmet exploration. You wouldn't find anyone asking for a doggy bag because there wouldn't be any leftovers. Every scrap was precious. So while your modern self might recoil at the thought of a diet so heavily reliant on bland, boiled grains and garden greens, for the medieval peasant, this was sustenance. This was survival, and in a world where food scarcity was a constant shadow, the ability to turn humble ingredients into a filling, if unexciting meal, was a skill honed by generations of necessity. You might even find a strange comfort in the simplicity, a sort of grounding in the rhythms of the earth, far removed from the complex culinary landscape you left behind. Leaving the humble, earthy aromas of the peasant's hearth behind, you are now whisked away, as if by magic, to a different world entirely. The grand, echoing halls of a medieval castle or manor house. The air here is markedly different. Instead of damp earth and boiled greens, your senses are assaulted by a complex symphony of exotic aromas, the sharp tang of vinegar, the sweet perfume of dried fruits, and most prominently the pungent, heady fragrance of spices. This, my friend, is where the medieval culinary world truly explodes into a riot of colour and flavour, a stark contrast to the subdued palate of the commoner. For the nobility, food wasn't just sustenance, it was a dazzling display of wealth, power, and social standing. Imagine yourself seated at a long oak table, perhaps covered in fine linen, though forks are still a rarity, so you're mostly relying on knives, spoons, and your own fingers. Before you, servants in livery are presenting dish after dish, each more elaborate than the last. You might see roasted swans, peacocks redressed in their own feathers, wild boars' heads, or towering pasties filled with various meats. The sheer volume of food is astounding, designed not just to feed, but to impress and overwhelm. This was the era of the subtlety, an edible centerpiece that was less about eating and more about artistic display. Think sugar sculptures or marzipan figures of knights and dragons, often dyed in vibrant, unnatural colors using saffron, woad, or even ground minerals. It was dinner and a show, all rolled into one. The defining characteristic of noble cuisine, however, was the lavish use of spices. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, ginger. These weren't just flavorings, they were status symbols. Sourced from distant lands like India, Indonesia, and the Middle East, they traveled vast distances, passing through many hands, making them incredibly expensive. To use them freely in your cooking was a clear declaration of your immense wealth and connections. A medieval noble's kitchen might use more saffron in a single meal than a peasant would see in a lifetime. This led to dishes that, to our modern palates, might seem a bit confused. Sweet and sour combinations were incredibly popular, with sugar or honey often paired with vinegar and strong spices. You might have a meat dish flavored with cinnamon and plums, or fish cooked with ginger and dates. It was an adventurous, often surprising blend of flavors. A peculiar fact about medieval aristocratic dining is the obsession with gilding food, not just a sprinkle, but literally covering roasted meats, game birds, or even sometimes entire pies with a thin layer of gold leaf. Imagine a roasted chicken shimmering like a treasure. This wasn't for taste, obviously. Gold leaf is flavorless, but purely for ostentatious display. It was a visual feast, a way to signal your incredible opulence to your guests. While historians still argue whether this practice was primarily for showing off wealth, or if there was a deeper symbolic meaning tied to religious reverence for gold, it certainly made for a dazzling, if perhaps slightly indigestible, dinner. The preparation of these elaborate meals required a highly skilled team of cooks, scullions, and servers, all working in bustling, often chaotic, castle kitchens. These kitchens were usually separate buildings to mitigate fire risks and to keep the heat and smells away from the main living quarters. Imagine massive fireplaces capable of roasting an entire ox, bubbling cauldrons, and long tables for preparation. The head cook, or maître de cuisine, was a highly respected and well-paid member of the household, responsible for not only the food, but often for the entire household's provisions. Despite the abundance, medieval noble diets weren't always perfectly balanced. There was a distinct lack of fresh vegetables, which were often considered peasant food. Fruits were eaten, but not in the same quantities as meat in rich, spiced dishes. Gout, a painful condition caused by an excess of uric acid, was famously dubbed the rich man's disease, due to the noble diet heavy in meat and wine. So while they ate far better than the common folk, their indulgences came with their own set of health consequences. You'd quickly learn that dining at a noble table was less about quiet enjoyment and more about performance. There were strict rules of etiquette, the proper way to carve a bird, the correct way to drink from a shared cup, and the unspoken hierarchy of seating. It was a world where every dish, every gesture, and every spice-laden bite reinforced the rigid social structure of the age. And as you watch the roasted peacock gleaming with gold, you can almost taste the power and prestige that permeated every aspect of noble life. Having sampled the opulent, spice-laden world of noble dining, you now notice a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a changing rhythm in the medieval calendar. You find yourself immersed in a different aspect of medieval eating habits, the fascinating, often strict interplay between feast days and fast days. This wasn't just about what you ate, but when you ate it, dictated largely by the powerful influence of the church and the liturgical year. Forget your modern concept of cheat days. These were deeply ingrained traditions that shaped daily life for everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful king. Imagine living in a society where nearly half the year was designated as a fast day. That's right, the church, in its wisdom, mandated extensive periods of abstinence from meat, eggs, and dairy products. Every Friday, for instance, was a universal fast day, commemorating the crucifixion of Christ. Then there were the entire seasons of Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, and numerous other saints' days and vigils scattered throughout the year. For pious medieval folk, these rules were not suggestions, they were commandments, breaches of which could lead to eternal damnation, or at the very least a stern talking to from your local priest. So, what did you eat on a fast day? Well, certainly no roasted boar or chicken. Instead, the diet pivoted heavily towards fish. If you lived near the coast, this might mean fresh cod, herring, or mackerel. Inland, freshwater fish like pike, carp, or eels were common. Monasteries, with their sophisticated agricultural practices, often maintained elaborate fish ponds specifically to ensure a supply of fish for fast days. Beyond fish, your fast day menu would include plenty of vegetables, pulses like peas and beans, and of course, bread. Olive oil or other plant-based oils replaced butter and animal fats. It's a diet that, ironically, might be considered quite healthy by today's standards, rich in fiber and lean protein. A rather quirky aspect of fast day regulations was the sometimes strained interpretation of what constituted fish. Over time, the definition became a bit flexible. For example, beavers, whose tails were scaly and lived in water, were sometimes controversially deemed acceptable for consumption on fast days by certain religious orders. Similarly, some larger waterfowl, like puffins or barnacle geese, which spent significant time in or near water, occasionally found themselves on the fish menu. Historians still argue whether these were genuine theological interpretations or simply creative culinary loopholes sought by those weary of a strictly fish and vegetable diet. Perhaps a bit of both, demonstrating the human desire for a little variety, even in the face of strict religious observance. In stark contrast to the austerity of fast days were the joyous feast days. These were celebrations: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, weddings, coronations, or simply the arrival of a significant guest, when the dietary restrictions were lifted and food flowed freely. These were the times for indulgence, for grand banquets, and for the lavish displays of wealth we discussed earlier. Imagine the anticipation. After weeks or months of simple meatless meals, the sight and smell of roasted meats, rich stews, and sweet pastries must have been intoxicating. These feasts were not just about eating, they were social events, opportunities for networking, for reinforcing community bonds, and for celebrating life's milestone. For the common person, a feast day might mean a rare taste of meat, perhaps a bit of salted pork, or a piece of game, along with some finer ale. For the nobility, it was a chance to truly show off. The more extravagant the feast, the higher the host's status. Cooks would work tirelessly for days, preparing multiple courses, often presenting them with elaborate ceremonies. You'd see tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, game birds, and intricately prepared dishes, a visual spectacle designed to impress every guest. This cyclical nature of feasting and fasting created a unique rhythm in medieval life. It wasn't just about nutrition, it was about piety, social cohesion, and the very fabric of society. The fasts instilled discipline and reinforced religious devotion, while the feasts provided moments of joyful release and communal celebration. It was a world where your plate and what was on it was deeply intertwined with your faith and your place in the grand tapestry of medieval society. You learn to appreciate those occasional bursts of culinary freedom even more, knowing they are hard-won breaks from the norm. As the echoes of grand feasts and solemn fasts fade, your medieval culinary tour brings you to a particularly intriguing and often surprising corner, the world of sweet treats. If your modern mind conjures images of chocolate bars, gummy candies, or elaborate cakes, you're in for a stark yet oddly charming surprise. In the Middle Ages, sugar was a phenomenally expensive import, largely a luxury item from the East, making everyday sweetness a rare and precious commodity. So, what did you reach for when a craving for something sugary struck? More often than not, it was honey, the liquid gold of the medieval world. Imagine, if you will, the hum of bees, a familiar sound in the medieval countryside. Beekeeping was a vital, respected skill, and honey was the primary sweetener for millennia before sugar became widely available and affordable. You'd find it drizzled over fruits, mixed into drinks, or used to sweeten pastries. It wasn't just a sweetener. It was also valued for its perceived medicinal properties and its ability to preserve food. Monasteries in particular were often adept at beekeeping, ensuring a steady supply for their own tables and for trade. Beyond honey, the medieval sweet tooth found its satisfaction in simple, often fruit-based concoctions. Fritters were a popular choice. Think of them as early donuts or pancakes, dollops of batter, often mixed with fruit like apples or berries, deep fried in animal fat until golden and crispy. These were rustic, comforting treats, a far cry from the delicate patisserie of later centuries. You might find them dusted with a pinch of the precious sugar, if you were incredibly lucky, or perhaps a sprinkle of cinnamon, which was itself a luxury. A particularly quirky and surprisingly common sweet item was quince paste, often referred to as marmalade, long before citrus fruits took over the name. Quince, a tart, fragrant fruit, was boiled down with honey or sugar until it formed a thick, jelly-like consistency that could be cut into squares. This wasn't just a dessert. It was often served at the end of meals, acting as a digestive or palate cleanser. It's the ancestor of our modern fruit jellies and gums, but with a distinct floral flavor that might surprise you. Historians still argue whether the widespread popularity of quince paste was due to its natural abundance, its unique flavor profile, or simply its ability to be preserved for longer periods. Dried fruits were another staple of the medieval sweet arsenal. Dates, figs, raisins, and prunes, often imported from warmer climes, provided concentrated bursts of sweetness and energy. These were eaten on their own, added to pottages, or incorporated into more elaborate baked goods for the wealthy. Imagine how valuable a handful of plump sweet dates would have been on a cold, dreary medieval day, a taste of sunshine from distant land. For the nobility, sugar, when available, was used in astonishing ways, often demonstrating more about status than culinary skill. Suckets, candied fruits and nuts were highly prized, and as we touched on earlier, sugar was increasingly used for elaborate sugar sculptures or subtleties that adorned banquet tables. These weren't meant to be eaten, or at least not entirely. They were edible art, showcasing the host's immense wealth and the skill of their confectioner. Picture a towering castle made entirely of sugar, complete with tiny edible knights. It was the ultimate flex of medieval hospitality. Spices, surprisingly, also found their way into medieval sweets. Ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, while expensive, were used to add warmth and complexity to honeyed cakes, tarts, and even some fruit dishes. The distinction between savory and sweet was often blurred in medieval cooking, and you might find a spiced meat pie next to a spiced fruit tart, both equally acceptable. So, while you won't be finding any artisanal chocolate shops, you'd learn to appreciate the simple, intense sweetness of honey, the rustic charm of a warm fritter, and the exotic delight of a dried date. It was a world where sweetness was a luxury, a treat to be savoured, and the ingenuity of cooks to create delights from limited resources was truly remarkable. Your palate might need a bit of adjustment, but you'd find yourself surprisingly drawn to the comforting, earthy sweetness that having indulged in the medieval sweet tooth, your attention now naturally drifts from solid sustenance to the more fluid, yet equally vital, aspect of medieval daily life: beverages. In an era before widespread sanitation and bottled water, what you drank was just as crucial and often more dangerous than what you ate. You quickly learn that the medieval world wasn't exactly teeming with sparkling clean tap water. So, what filled the cups and quenched the thirst of peasants and nobles alike? Primarily, it was ale, often weak, sometimes questionable, but always plentiful. Imagine starting your day not with coffee or tea, but with a swig of ale. For many, especially labourers, ale was a staple consumed throughout the day, even by children, though theirs would be a much weaker, small ale. Why? Because brewing involved boiling the water, making it a far safer option than the often contaminated well or river water available directly. The fermentation process also made it mildly alcoholic, providing some calories and a gentle buzz, perhaps taking the edge off a particularly grueling day. It was a caloric supplement as much as a thirst quencher. The ale of the Middle Ages wasn't heavily hopped like modern beers, so it would have been sweeter, cloudier, and often quite thick, more like a liquid bread. Next to ale, wine held a place of prestige, though its accessibility varied wildly. In wine-producing regions like France, Italy, and parts of Germany, wine was common for all social classes, with varying qualities, of course. For the wealthy, fine imported wines from Bordeaux or Burgundy were a sign of status. For the common person, it might be a simpler, local vintage, often consumed young and unaged. The quality could be inconsistent, and it was often diluted with water, a practice that continued even among the nobility. You might find yourself offered a goblet of spiced wine known as hippocras, a blend of red wine infused with ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and sugar, a luxurious treat reserved for special occasions and often served at the end of a feast. A rather curious and somewhat risky aspect of medieval drinking was the quality of the water. While boiling water for ale made it safer, direct consumption of water from rivers and local wells was a gamble. Urban centres, with their dense populations and lack of proper sewage systems, often had highly contaminated water sources. This is a mainstream historical fact that underscores why fermented beverages were so prevalent. They were, quite simply, safer. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval medical texts actually warned against drinking too much cold water, believing it could cause chills and illness. They advocated for room temperature or even warm water, often infused with herbs if you had to drink it straight. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine understanding of germ theory, unlikely, or simply an observation that people got sick from tainted cold water more often. For the very poor, or in regions where brewing was difficult, simple spring water was the only option, and it carried significant risks. You'd quickly learn to differentiate between a fresh, flowing spring and a stagnant pond. Hydration was a constant challenge, balancing safety with availability. It's a stark reminder of how fundamental access to clean water is, a luxury we often take for granted today. Beyond ale and wine, other beverages made occasional appearances. Cider made from apples was common in apple-growing regions. Mead, a fermented honey drink, was an ancient beverage, particularly popular in Northern Europe. And for the very, very sick, or those of a monastic order, even milk, though perishable and less commonly drunk by adults, might be prescribed. So, as you traverse this medieval landscape, your choice of beverage becomes a telling detail. Are you a peasant, relying on your daily ration of thin ale, perhaps a murky cup of well water if desperate? Or are you a noble, toasting with spiced wine, while your servants bring endless pitchers of stronger brew? The clinking of pottery mugs and the pouring of liquid form a constant underlying soundtrack to medieval life, a testament to the ingenuity and necessity of turning common ingredients into safer, if not always delicious, drinks. You'll certainly appreciate a modern glass of filtered water after this. Having quenched your thirst with medieval brews, your attention is now drawn by a cacophony of sounds and a medley of enticing, and occasionally suspicious, smells emanating from the bustling streets. You find yourself navigating the narrow, often muddy, lanes of a medieval town, where the concept of a sit-down restaurant is largely non-existent. Instead, you encounter the vibrant, slightly chaotic world of street food. This was the medieval equivalent of your modern food trucks and takeout joints, providing quick hot meals for those on the go, or those without the means to cook for themselves. Imagine the scene: itinerant vendors shouting their wares, the sizzle of fat over open coals, and the tantalizing aroma of baked goods wafting through the air. What dominates this landscape, you quickly observe, are pies and puddings. These weren't just desserts. They were often savory, encased wonders designed for portability and sustenance. A hand pie, for instance, could be a complete meal in itself, a convenient package of meat, vegetables, or even fish, baked into a sturdy pastry crust. The crust itself was often less about eating and more about acting as a disposable container, a coffin to hold the precious filling. You'd eat the contents and discard the crust, or perhaps give it to a less fortunate soul, much like the trenches we discussed earlier. These pies came in all shapes and sizes, filled with whatever was available: minced meat, pork, beef or game if you were lucky, onions, herbs, and sometimes even dried fruit, reflecting the medieval preference for sweet and savory combinations. The fillings were often pre-cooked before being encased, and the pies themselves could be bought hot or cold, making them incredibly versatile for travelers, tradesmen, or even city dwellers who lived in lodgings without cooking facilities. A particularly quirky medieval street food item was the umble pie. You might think of it as a play on words for humility, but it was quite literal. It was a pie made from the umbles, the entrails and organs of an animal, such as heart, liver, and kidneys. These were considered less desirable cuts, often given to servants or the poor. So to eat humble pie quite literally meant to consume these lowly internal parts. It's a fascinating origin for a common idiom, demonstrating how deeply food was woven into the language and social fabric of the time. Historians still argue whether eating humble pie originally meant accepting one's lower status or simply being forced to consume less desirable food. Beyond pies, you'd find a variety of other quick bites. Sausages, often made on the spot, would be grilling, their smoky aroma cutting through the general miasma of the street. Fried fish, especially in coastal towns, would be a popular choice on fast days. And for something a bit more substantial, there might be sellers offering hot puddings, not the sweet dessert kind you imagine, but savory concoctions often made from grains, blood or offal, boiled in a cloth bag or animal intestine. Think of a very early form of black pudding or haggis. These were calorie-dense and warming, perfect for a cold day. The popularity of street food also tells you a lot about medieval urban life. Cities were growing, and not everyone had access to a kitchen, or the time, or the resources to prepare a full meal. For apprentices, journeymen, labourers, and transient populations, these vendors were essential. They provided quick, affordable nourishment, allowing people to grab a bite and continue with their day. It was fast food, but with a distinctly medieval flavour and freshness standard that would make a modern health inspector weep. So, as you jostle through the crowded marketplace, dodging carts and stepping over refuse, the sights and smells of medieval street food offer a vivid snapshot of daily life. The calls of the vendors, the steam rising from the hot pies, and the simple, robust flavours of these portable meals would become an undeniable part of your medieval experience. You might even find yourself reaching for a hot meat pie, despite your initial reservations, realizing that sometimes hunger is the best sauce. After navigating the bustling, fragrant world of medieval street food, your journey through time now leads you into a more practical, yet often rather pungent, aspect of medieval life: food preservation techniques. In an age devoid of refrigeration, freezers, or even reliable canning methods, keeping food from spoiling was a constant battle against time, microbes, and the elements. Imagine the ingenuity required to stretch the bounty of a harvest or the spoils of a hunt across lean winter months, or through long journeys. These methods were essential for survival, even if they sometimes resulted in tastes and textures that might make your modern palate wince. The most widespread and vital preservation method was salting. You'd see massive quantities of salt being used to cure meat and fish. Picture barrels overflowing with layers of pork, beef, or herring, all packed tightly in salt. The salt draws out moisture, creating an environment where bacteria simply cannot thrive. This process fundamentally changed the flavor and texture of the food. Salted meat, like your familiar salt pork or bacon, though medieval bacon was often less fatty and more like cured ham, would be incredibly salty and tough, requiring extensive soaking and boiling before it could be eaten. It was a primary source of protein during the winter months, offering a grim but reliable sustenance. Closely related to salting was drying. Grains, fruits, and even some vegetables were laid out in the sun or hung in smoky, airy spaces to remove their moisture content. Think of dried apples, plums, prunes, or the ever-present dried beans and peas that filled many a pottage. Fish, too, was often sun-dried, particularly in northern regions, resulting in rock-hard, almost petrified sustenance that could last for ages. You might encounter the smell of cod drying in the sun, a scent that, shall we say, is an acquired taste. Smoking was another prevalent method, especially for meats and fish. Hanging cuts of meat or whole fish in a smokehouse, where they were exposed to the smoke from burning wood, not only dried them, but also infused them with preservative compounds from the smoke. This imparted a distinct smoky flavor that permeated everything and acted as a deterrent to insects and spoilage. Imagine the interior of a medieval smokehouse. Dark, sooty, and filled with the rich, meaty, smoky aroma. A particularly quirky preservation method involved fermentation and pickling. While we've discussed ale and wine, fermentation was also used for vegetables. Sauerkraut, for example, is a very old method of preserving cabbage by lactofermentation. Vegetables were also preserved in vinegar, turning them into pickles. These acidic environments prevented the growth of spoilage bacteria. This provided a crucial source of vitamins during the winter when fresh produce was scarce, adding a tangy kick to an otherwise bland diet. Historians still argue whether some of these fermentation processes were truly understood scientifically, or if they were simply passed down as traditional, successful methods. Beyond these common techniques, you'd also find less frequent, more regional methods. Burying food in peat bogs or cold cellars for natural refrigeration, or preserving fruits in honey, were also practiced. The wealthy might even use the newly introduced, extremely expensive sugar to candy fruits, creating elaborate suckets that would last for months, a testament to both their culinary skill and their deep pockets. The effectiveness of these methods varied, of course. Food spoilage was still a constant threat, and food poisoning was an ever-present danger, though its causes were poorly understood. You'd learn to be wary of strange odors or textures, to trust your senses, and to accept that sometimes food simply went bad. It was a world where you never wasted a crumb, and where the ingenuity of preserving the harvest was literally a matter of life and death, shaping not just what people ate, but how they lived and planned their year. The pungent, salty, smoky aromas of these preserved foods would become a familiar backdrop to your medieval experience. Having explored the often gritty realities of food preservation, your medieval journey now takes a turn that might make your stomach churn a little more. An examination of hygiene and food preparation. In an era before germ theory, widespread hand washing, or even basic sanitation standards as we understand them, medieval kitchens and dining practices operated on a very different set of assumptions. The good news? You probably built up quite an immune system. The bad news? You wouldn't want to see a health inspector's report. Imagine stepping into a typical medieval kitchen, whether it's a bustling castle operation or a humble peasant's hearth. The first thing you'd notice is the pervasive smell. Wood smoke, simmering stews, but also, quite undeniably, the lingering odor of unwashed surfaces, animal waste, and general grime. Kitchens were often shared spaces, sometimes open to the elements, and in peasant homes, animals might wander freely through the cooking area. Cleanliness, as a concept, was often more about appearance than about microscopic organisms. Sweeping the floor and wiping down surfaces might occur, but deep cleaning or sanitization was virtually unknown. Hand washing, while not entirely unheard of, was not the routine, rigorous practice we adhere to today. Cooks might wipe their hands on an apron or rinse them briefly, but certainly not with soap and hot running water. Food was often handled with bare hands, from preparation to serving. Cross-contamination? That wasn't even a word, let alone a concept. Raw meats might be prepared on the same surfaces as cooked foods or vegetables, and utensils might be rinsed, not thoroughly washed and sanitized between uses. A mainstream historical fact that illustrates this lack of hygiene is the widespread consumption of ale and wine instead of water. As we touched on earlier, this wasn't just for pleasure. It was a practical necessity because water sources, especially in towns and cities, were often heavily contaminated with human and animal waste. Boiling water for ale killed many of the harmful pathogens, making it a safer option. This practice speaks volumes about the general state of environmental sanitation and its direct impact on health. Now, for a truly quirky tidbit, medieval recipes often included instructions that would make a modern chef blanch. For instance, some recipes for pies or stews would instruct the cook to cut out the bad parts of meat, rather than discarding the entire piece. This meant that meat that was clearly starting to spoil might still be incorporated, after a cursory trim. The strong spices used by the nobility weren't just for flavor or status, they also served a practical purpose in masking the taste and smell of less than fresh ingredients. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of spices was to simply cover up spoilage, or if their cost implicitly meant they were used on the best ingredients. It was likely a bit of both, but the masking potential was certainly a benefit. Waste disposal was another significant challenge. Food scraps, animal entrails, and general refuse would often be tossed into the street or into open pits, becoming breeding grounds for rats, flies, and other vermin. These pests, in turn, carried diseases directly into homes and kitchens, creating a constant cycle of contamination. Imagine trying to prepare a meal while fending off flies and worrying about what else might be crawling across your cutting board. Even dining practices contributed to the overall lack of hygiene. Shared trenchers, communal drinking cups, especially in taverns, and the widespread use of fingers rather than individual forks meant that germs could spread rapidly. While polite society had rules about not dipping your fingers too deeply or wiping your mouth before drinking from a shared cup, these were rudimentary by modern standards. So, as you observe the medieval kitchen, you might find yourself suppressing a gag or two. It's a stark reminder of how far we've come in understanding public health and food safety. The medieval experience teaches you that survival often meant making do with what you had, and sometimes that included a healthy dose of microbial exposure. You'd probably think twice about ordering that medieval takeout after seeing where it was prepared. Having braved the murky waters of medieval hygiene, your journey now naturally flows into a much more somber, yet intrinsically linked aspect of medieval life: the profound connection between food and disease. In a world without antibiotics, advanced medical understanding, or robust public health systems, diet and food safety played an immediate and often deadly role in the well-being of the population. You quickly grasp that your survival was often a gamble, influenced by everything from a bad harvest to a poorly cooked meal. Imagine the constant threat of illness that hung over every medieval household. Food poisoning, or what they might have vaguely called flux or bloody ague, was a common occurrence. Uncooked or improperly cooked meats, contaminated water, spoiled dairy, and poorly stored grains could all harbor bacteria and toxins that led to severe gastrointestinal distress, dehydration, and often death. For a body already weakened by hard labor and perhaps a monotonous diet, even a mild case of food poisoning could be fatal. There was no easily accessible IV drip to rehydrate you, no anti-diarrhea medication to slow the inevitable. A mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this link is the devastating impact of famine. While not strictly a disease in itself, famine directly led to widespread illness and death. When harvest failed, or when conflict disrupted food supplies, entire populations faced starvation. Malnutrition severely weakened the immune system, making people highly susceptible to opportunistic infections like typhus, dysentery, or the dreaded plague. Your body, already struggling for calories, would have little defense against these invaders. The Great Famine of 1317, for instance, wiped out millions across Europe, a stark reminder of humanity's precarious dependence on a stable food supply. A truly quirky tidbit concerns ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire. This horrific condition was caused by consuming rye bread contaminated with a fungus called ergot. The symptoms were terrifying: burning sensations in the limbs, hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene that could lead to limbs falling off. Imagine eating your daily bread, your primary sustenance, only for it to slowly poison you, causing agonizing pain and a descent into madness. It's believed that outbreaks of ergotism, particularly in communal bread-baking communities, were often mistaken for divine punishment or demonic possession, highlighting the medieval lack of understanding of foodborne illnesses. Historians still argue about the precise frequency and impact of ergotism, as its symptoms could be confused with other ailments. Beyond direct poisoning, dietary deficiencies were rampant. While the wealthy might suffer from gout due to excessive meat and wine, the poor often battled chronic malnutrition. Lack of fresh fruit and vegetables, especially during winter, led to deficiencies like scurvy from lack of vitamin C and rickets from lack of vitamin D. Imagine suffering from bleeding gums, joint pain, and extreme fatigue, all because your diet lacked a few essential nutrients that are readily available to us today. Even cooking methods played a role. The medieval preference for heavily boiled, long-simmered dishes, while often aimed at tenderness, also destroyed many water-soluble vitamins. While this might have rendered some dangerous substances harmless, it simultaneously stripped nutrients. You learn quickly that fresh, if you could get it, was always best, but often out of reach. So, as you walk through a medieval village, you see the gaunt faces, the shuffling gaits, the constant coughs and ailments. You realize that food, while essential for life, was also a constant source of potential danger. Every meal was a small act of trust, a hope that the food was sound, that it wouldn't bring sickness rather than strength. It's a sobering thought, making you appreciate the quiet miracle of a well-stocked, sanitized modern supermarket and the unseen guardians of public health. Stepping away from the unsettling realities of medieval disease, your journey now transports you into a realm of culinary wonder, albeit one often reserved for the most privileged, the fascinating world of exotic ingredients from afar. While the everyday medieval diet was largely local and seasonal, the desire for novelty and luxury, coupled with burgeoning trade routes, brought a surprising array of foreign goods to European tables, transforming meals for the wealthy into opulent displays of global connection. Imagine the sheer distance these ingredients traveled: spices from the Spice Islands, sugar from the Middle East, dried fruits from North Africa. These weren't just commodities, they were tangible links to mysterious, far-off lands, imbued with an aura of rarity and prestige. The Silk Roads and burgeoning maritime routes brought these treasures to European ports, eventually making their way, often at astronomical cost, to the larders of kings, queens, and powerful nobles. Foremost among these exotic imports were the spices we briefly touched on earlier: pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, and ginger. These weren't merely flavor enhancers. They were central to the identity of noble cuisine. Imagine a merchant caravan laden with sacks of these precious commodities, traversing vast deserts and treacherous mountains, facing bandits and extreme weather. Each pinch of cinnamon in a medieval tart represented a colossal journey and significant risk. The demand for these spices was insatiable, driving exploration and shaping geopolitical landscapes. You might find yourself marveling at a tiny container of saffron, realizing its weight in gold was almost literal. Beyond spices, sugar was another incredibly valuable import. Originally from India, it was cultivated and processed in the Middle East and later in the Mediterranean, slowly making its way north. For much of the Middle Ages, sugar was so expensive it was considered a spice itself, used sparingly by apothecaries as medicine or by confectioners for elaborate artistic displays rather than as an everyday sweetener. To serve a dish sweetened purely with sugar rather than honey was a profound statement of wealth. A mainstream historical fact is that the Crusades, while primarily religious wars, played a significant, albeit indirect, role in increasing European exposure to a wider array of Eastern foodstuffs and culinary traditions. Returning crusaders brought back not just stories, but sometimes new ingredients like rice, lemons, and certain spices that became more widely known, even if still expensive. Now, for a particularly quirky tidbit, the medieval fascination with almond. While not as exotic as some spices, almonds were primarily imported from warmer Mediterranean climates and became incredibly popular in medieval aristocratic cooking. They were used in countless ways, ground into almond milk, a common substitute for cow's milk, especially on fast days, thickened into sauces or used in pastries and confectionery. Their versatility and slight exoticism made them a highly sought-after ingredient. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of almond milk was primarily a practical solution for fast days, or if it was favored for its unique flavor and perceived health benefits. It's likely a blend of both, showing an interesting culinary adaptation. Other exotic fruits, such as dates and figs from North Africa and the Middle East, were also prized, often consumed dried for preservation and portability. Lemons and pomegranates, though rarer, occasionally appeared on noble tables, adding a tart or vibrant note to dishes otherwise dominated by rich meats and heavy spices. Rice, too, slowly made its way into European cuisine, initially as a luxury grain, often used in sweet puddings or as a thickener rather than as a primary starch. The acquisition and display of these exotic ingredients were a clear symbol of power and status. To host a feast featuring dishes heavily spiced, sugared, or adorned with imported fruits was to demonstrate not just wealth, but also influence and connections to the wider world. It was a subtle, yet powerful form of soft power, showing off the reach of your trade networks and the sophistication of your household. So, as you gaze upon a dish dusted with precious saffron, you're not just seeing food, you're witnessing the culmination of perilous journeys and vast mercantile networks, all brought to a single luxurious plate. Having marveled at the global reach of medieval ingredients, your focus now shifts from the raw materials to the stage upon which they were consumed, the elaborate and often rigidly structured world of food and social rituals. In medieval society, a meal was rarely just about satisfying hunger. It was a performance, a reinforcement of hierarchy, and a deeply embedded part of communal life. Understanding these rituals offers a fascinating glimpse into the intricate social fabric of the age. Imagine yourself at a medieval banquet. You quickly realize that your seating position isn't random. It's a precise indicator of your social standing. The most important guests, along with the lord and lady of the manor, would sit at the high table, often on a raised dais, signifying their elevated status. Lesser nobles and honored guests would be seated at tables arranged perpendicularly further down the hall, with the least important individuals relegated to the furthest, draftiest end. Every place setting, every shared trencher, and every shared cup subtly reinforced the pecking order. You'd instinctively know your place, and to sit above it would be a grievous breach of etiquette. The act of eating itself was steeped in formality, particularly at noble tables. Forks were still a rarity for most of the period, so fingers were the primary utensils. However, this didn't mean a free-for-all. Strict rules of decorum applied. Don't plunge your hand too deep into a communal dish, don't pick your teeth at the table, and certainly don't wipe your greasy fingers on your clothes. Instead, you might see small finger bowls or pieces of bread used for wiping. Carving the meat was often a ceremonial act, performed by a designated carver with great skill and flourish, again emphasizing the ritualistic nature of the meal. A mainstream historical fact is the practice of breaking bread as a symbol of hospitality and fellowship. This wasn't just a casual phrase, it held deep significance. To share bread with someone, especially a stranger, was an act of trust and a sign of welcome. It forged a temporary bond, often offering protection under the host's roof. This ritualistic sharing of the most basic and vital food underscored its fundamental role in medieval life and society. A particularly quirky detail about medieval dining rituals involves the elaborate table manners books that began to appear especially for young noble. These weren't just about practical etiquette, they were moral guides. One popular instruction was not to blow your nose into the tablecloth, sensible enough perhaps, but another might advise against talking with your mouth full, or admonish you for putting your elbows on the table, much like your grandmother might. Historians still argue whether these lengthy guides were truly indicative of widespread bad manners, or if they were aspirational texts designed to educate a burgeoning social class on how to appear refined. Perhaps a bit of both, given the earthy realities of medieval life. Even the presentation of food was a ritual. Dishes were often brought out in grand processions, sometimes accompanied by music. The subtleties, the elaborate edible centerpieces, were designed to awe and entertain, not just to feed. The meal might be interspersed with entertainment, such as minstrels, jesters, or acrobats, turning a simple dinner into a multi-sensory experience. This wasn't just about filling bellies, it was about demonstrating the host's generosity, their cultural sophistication, and their ability to command resources and entertainment. For the common folk, rituals were simpler but no less important. Communal meals, often shared during harvest festivals or on religious feast days, reinforced community bond. The sharing of simple pottage or a rare piece of meat would be a moment of togetherness, a brief respite from the arduous daily grind. Even the act of collective bread baking at a communal oven, as we mentioned earlier, was a social ritual, a time for gossip and shared labor. So, as you observe the intricacies of medieval dining, you realize that every bite, every pour, every seat at the table was imbued with meaning. Food was a language of power, piety, and community, spoken through forks, or lack thereof, shared trenchers, and the strict, unspoken rules of medieval social engagement. It's a world where breaking bread was a profound act, and your place at the table defined your place in the world. Having observed the intricate social dance of medieval dining, your focus now naturally shifts from the eaters to the unsung heroes and heroines behind the scenes. The medieval cook. In an era when food preparation was laborious, dangerous, and often highly skilled, the cook was far more than just a kitchen hand. They were essential members of a household, responsible for sustenance, health, and, for the wealthy, a significant part of a household's prestige. Imagine the sheer physical demands of a medieval kitchen. Forget gas stoves and electric ovens. Everything revolved around open fires, massive cauldrons, and heavy cast iron pots. The heat was immense, the smoke pervasive, and the risk of burns constant. The cook, often sweltering in this environment, would spend hours chopping, grinding, stirring, and roasting, often without the benefit of readily available running water or modern conveniences. It was a profession that required not just culinary skill, but immense stamina and a high tolerance for discomfort. For a peasant family, the cook was typically the woman of the house, responsible for preparing simple, nourishing meals over an open hearth. Her skills would lie in making the most of meager ingredients, stretching a pot of pottage, and ensuring the family had enough bread. She would also be responsible for foraging, preserving, and making simple brews like small ale. Her kitchen was her home, her tools few but well used. In contrast, the noble household employed a highly specialized team, often led by a master cook or maître de cuisine. This individual was a formidable figure, responsible for the entire kitchen operation, from managing staff, scullions, larderers, turnspits, and assistants, to sourcing ingredients, planning menus, and overseeing the preparation of elaborate feasts. Their position was one of significant trust and authority, often earning them a good salary and considerable respect. Imagine the pressure of preparing a banquet for a visiting king, knowing that any mistake could reflect poorly on your lord. A mainstream historical fact is the significant role of spit roasting in noble kitchens. The cook would oversee the slow rotation of large cuts of meat or whole animals over an open fire. This required constant attention to ensure even cooking and to prevent burning. Often, a turnspit dog, a small dog specifically bred and trained to run on a treadmill connected to the spit, would be employed, a quirky historical detail that highlights the ingenious, if somewhat ethically dubious, solutions to mundane tasks. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of spit roasting was primarily for flavor, for display, or simply the most efficient way to cook large quantities of meat over an open flame. The medieval cook's knowledge went beyond mere recipes. They understood preservation techniques, the nuances of different types of game, the proper use of scarce spices, and often rudimentary medicinal uses of herb. They were often practical chemists and alchemists, transforming raw ingredients into palatable and hopefully safe food. Their skills were passed down through apprenticeship, from master to journeyman, a system of hands-on learning that built generations of culinary expertise. Despite their vital role, cooks often faced immense pressure. The expectation for lavish, impressive meals was constant, especially in noble households. Competition among cooks for prestigious positions was fierce, and a chef's reputation could make or break their career. And in a world without precise measurements or standardized ingredients, cooking was often an art of instinct, experience, and improvisation. So, as you watch the cook tirelessly working over the smoking hearth, perhaps wiping sweat from their brow, you gain a deep appreciation for their labor. They were the alchemists of daily sustenance, turning raw nature into nourishment, and, in the grander households, transforming a simple meal into a spectacle. Their calloused hands and smoke-stained faces tell a story of dedication, resilience, and the sheer hard work required to feed a medieval world. Having witnessed the tireless efforts of the medieval cook, your journey now brings you right to the table itself, where you'll observe the intimate details of dining utensils and practices. Forget the array of specialized silverware you're accustomed to. Medieval dining was a much more tactile, communal, and often less refined affair, reflecting both the practicalities of the age and its social customs. Imagine sitting down for a meal. The most striking absence you'll notice is the individual fork. While rudimentary forks existed in some parts of Europe, particularly Italy, they were not widely adopted for personal use across most of Europe until much later periods. For the vast majority of medieval people, your primary utensils were your knife, your spoon, and most importantly, your fingers. Every diner would carry their own knife, often a general-purpose tool used for cutting meat at the table, as well as for daily tasks. Spoons, usually made of wood, horn, or pewter for the wealthy, were used for soups, stews, and pottages. The reliance on fingers meant that personal cleanliness, or at least the appearance of it, was important, even if overall hygiene standards were low. You'd be expected to keep your hands relatively clean, perhaps using a small basin of water and a towel provided by servants if you were noble, or simply wiping them on bread or the tablecloth. Less polite, but common. There were strict, if sometimes quaint, rules of etiquette surrounding finger eating. Don't reach across others. Don't pick at your teeth with your knife, a common sight despite admonition, and don't dip your fingers too deeply into a communal dish. A mainstream historical fact that highlights this communal aspect is the widespread use of shared trenchers and drinking cups. We've mentioned trenchers, those thick slices of stale bread acting as edible plates. It was common for two diners to share a single trencher, or for a dish to be placed in the center of the table from which everyone ate directly. Similarly, communal drinking cups or pitchers were passed around even among strangers in a tavern or at a lower class meal. This fostered a sense of community and shared experience, even if it did create a superhighway for germ. A particularly quirky tidbit involves the surprising status of the salt cellar. In medieval banquets, salt was highly prized, both as a preservative and a seasoning, and often an expensive commodity. The salt cellar, therefore, became a powerful symbol of status and hierarchy. Important guests and the host would sit above the salt, meaning closer to the main salt cellar on the high table, indicating their elevated position. Lesser guests would sit below the salt further down the table, a clear visual indicator of their lower status. This seemingly simple object, a container for seasoning, became a potent social divider. Historians still argue whether this practice was purely symbolic or if it also reflected practical access to a scarce resource, but its social meaning is undeniable. The dining experience varied wildly by social class. For the peasant, a meal might be a simple affair, eaten quickly, often standing or squatting around a fire with little formality. They would eat heartily and efficiently, as food was fuel for labor. For the nobility, however, dining was a performance. Courses would be brought out with ceremony, accompanied by music or entertainment. There would be a clear order of service and elaborate rules governing everything from carving meat to engaging in polite conversation. Even chewing was a topic for medieval etiquette. Loud chewing or slurping was frowned upon, though the general noise level of a busy hall likely masked many such indiscretion. The pace of eating was often slow, especially at feasts, allowing for conversation and entertainment between courses. So, as you pick up your knife and prepare to delve into a medieval meal, you recognize that your hands are your most important tools. You learn to navigate shared dishes, to drink from a communal cup without too much thought, and to instinctively understand the unspoken rules of the table. It's a messy, communal, and intensely human way of eating, far removed from the individualized, sterile dining experiences of modernity, and it tells a powerful story about medieval life. Having shared the table, the utensils, and even the questionable hygiene of medieval diners, your journey through this culinary past now draws to a close. As the last echoes of communal feasting fade, we turn our gaze to the enduring impact of these medieval food habits, examining how they laid the foundations for much of what we eat and how we eat today. The food's lasting legacy is far more profound than you might initially imagine, subtly shaping our modern culinary traditions in ways we often overlook. Imagine for a moment the continuity, that ubiquitous loaf of bread, the foundation of the medieval diet, remains a staple worldwide. While its preparation has evolved, the very concept of a daily bread, whether it's a baguette, a sourdough, or a simple sliced loaf, is a direct descendant of those heavy, sustaining medieval loaves. The reliance on grains like wheat, rye, and barley continues to fuel billions, a testament to their enduring efficiency as a food source. The medieval understanding of seasonality and local produce, born of necessity, has found a renewed appreciation in our modern world. While we have global supply chains, the farm-to-table movement, and the emphasis on eating fresh, local produce, hark back to a time when your diet was entirely dictated by what grew in your region and what time of year it was. You've seen how resourceful medieval people were with their native plants and limited growing seasons, a lesson in sustainable eating centuries before the term existed. A mainstream historical fact that demonstrates this lasting legacy is the enduring popularity of pies and stews. These hearty, often one-pot meals, which were central to both peasant and noble tables, are still comfort food staples across many cultures. From shepherd's pie to cassoulet, from beef stew to chicken pot pie, the principle of slow-cooked ingredients, often encased in pastry or served with bread, continues to warm our homes and satisfy our hunger, a direct culinary inheritance from the Middle Ages. A particularly quirky example of a lingering medieval culinary practice is the continued, albeit niche, use of sweet and savory combinations. While perhaps less overt than a roasted swan stuffed with spiced fruit, you still find hints of this medieval preference in modern dishes like pork and applesauce, turkey with cranberry sauce, or even the subtle sweetness in some barbecue rub. It's a culinary ghost, a flavor memory from a time when sugar and spices were exotic and used without the strict category boundaries we often impose today. Historians still argue about the precise moment when the strict division between sweet and savory really took hold in Western cuisine, but the medieval palate was certainly more adventurous in its mixing. Even our drinking habits bear medieval imprints. The widespread consumption of ale and wine, safer than water then, evolved into the brewing and winemaking industries we know today. While our water is now clean, the social rituals surrounding alcoholic beverages, the toast, the shared drink, carry echoes of those communal medieval gatherings. Consider the role of the feast. While we no longer have multi-day banquets with gilded peacocks, the concept of a celebratory meal, a Thanksgiving dinner, a Christmas feast, or a wedding reception, where food is central to gathering and expressing joy, is a direct continuation of medieval feasting traditions. The desire to display abundance, to impress guests, and to bond over a shared table remains a powerful human impulse. Finally, the very concept of the professional cook, from the humble village baker to the celebrated chef, has its roots in the medieval kitchen. The transmission of culinary knowledge, the importance of skill, and the dedication required to feed a community all began in those smoky, bustling medieval spaces. As you slowly withdraw from the Middle Ages, the cacophony of the marketplace, the sizzle of the street food, the quiet warmth of the peasant's hearth, and the grandeur of the noble banquet begin to fade, you might find yourself a little more appreciative of your refrigerator, your clean tap water, and the diverse, readily available food in your local supermarket. But perhaps too you carry a newfound respect for the ingenuity, resilience, and sheer determination of medieval people who, despite overwhelming odds, found ways to nourish themselves, celebrate life, and create a culinary heritage that, in subtle ways, continues to feed us even now.